Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Global Sovereign AI Opportunity webinar. I'm Hilary Carter, SVP of Research at the Linux Foundation, and I'm excited to be your host and moderator for today's discussion. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you joining us today, including and especially our expert speakers. Today, we're joined by Lucie May Cafe, EU Policy Lead and Applied Researcher at Hugging Face, Lewis Stewart, Head of Strategic Initiatives at NVIDIA, Colin Eberhardt, CTO at Scott Logic, and Mark Collier, Chief Operating Officer at Open Infra Foundation. Welcome, everybody. A few housekeeping items before we get started. If you're watching this webinar live on LinkedIn, feel free to drop your questions in the comments section. If you're joining us on Zoom, all attendees are muted by default, but you can submit questions anytime using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the webinar, we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. This is an official webinar of the Linux Foundation, and all participants are asked to follow our code of conduct. Please be respectful and avoid posting anything in the Q&A that violates these guidelines. Finally, today's session is being recorded, and it will be shared on the LF AI and Data Foundation YouTube channel and posted on the webinar page following this event. We'll be following this webinar series with the survey on sovereign AI, the Global AI Strategy Survey, so please subscribe to LF Research or LF AI and Data mailing list to receive this survey and related research right into your inbox. Check the chat for the links. And with that, it's time to dig into our topic. We're here today because as generative AI is rapidly changing our world, it's apparent that it's not a one-size-fits-all scenario. For AI solutions to drive innovation and GDP growth for different organizations and countries and regions all across the world, they require models that embed culture, context, values, and new levels of specificity around industry-specific regulations, language, and so on. To paraphrase what was discussed in a recent fireside chat hosted by A16Z with NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang and Mistral CEO Arthur Mensch, countries need their own AI strategy, regions need their own AI strategy, and companies need their own AI strategy too. And they need corresponding solutions, protocols, governance structures, and collaboration to build out their unique organizational needs. And it is not just talk, it's really happening. Just yesterday, TELUS, a leading Canadian telecommunications company, announced it is launching 2 sovereign AI factories in the provinces of British Columbia and Quebec, powered by NVIDIA supercomputers as part of a pan-Canadian AI strategy. Quoting TELUS CEO Darren Entwistle, these powerful and secure facilities will ensure every piece of data, every computation, and every breakthrough will be born and remain within our borders. This will not only make Canada even more competitive and future-ready, will also enable the acceleration of innovations in key areas of importance in the hearts and minds of Canadians, such as health, sustainability, and agriculture. So this begs the question, are the barriers too high? Does everybody have compute? What are the infrastructure challenges, workforce challenges, and ethical challenges? There are vital inputs required, and that's where our experts today can weigh in, especially on the role of open source software, open source projects, and open source governance principles, and how they represent an important part of fulfilling organizational AI strategy. So now, enough from me, it's time to hear from our panelists. To please pressure test these assumptions, and we hope that our viewers will share their unique perspectives too. So my first question to the group, what is sovereign AI from your perspective? Is it a trend, and why do we need it? So Colin, let's start with you, and please contextualize your work and your point of view on the subject.
Sure. So yeah, I'm Colin Eberhardt. I'm the CTO of a software consultancy called Scott Logic, and I've been doing quite a bit of work with generative AI over the past few years. And my opinions on generative AI is I think it's a fantastic, powerful technology that we haven't yet realized the true potential of this technology. Open source, I think, is a vital foundation to generative AI, as it is a vital foundation to the cloud and many other technologies. When it comes to sovereign AI, I guess my opinions there are based on being a technologist and a citizen, and I'm a little bit skeptical about the notion of sovereign AI. Whilst Gen AI is an amazing technology, much of the money being invested in it is in pursuit of general intelligence. That's the big payoff for a lot of people investing in this technology. And at the moment, sovereign AI feels like it's taking a similar path. Much of the investment there appears to be in data centers in pursuit of more compute. I'm not entirely sure that's the best use of public spend and public money. I think that's better spend of private money in pursuit of a payoff which may or may not happen. And I guess worse still, I think the forces that are causing governments to invest in technology infrastructure are also forcing them to make decisions that I don't think are right for citizens. One of the most notable ones being copyright. You'll have all seen the Studio Ghibli images on the internet. Interestingly, the founder of that studio is quoted as saying, "I would never wish to incorporate this technology into my work. I strongly feel it's an insult to life itself." However, the UK and Europe have backed away from protecting copyright. And just a week ago, the Tony Blair Institute recommended that if the UK imposes laws that are too strict, it risks falling behind in the AI-driven economy and weakening its capacity to protect our national security interests. So I think, unfortunately, the direction we're taking is causing us to favor the pursuit of general intelligence and this big payoff, and to a certain extent forget some of the responsibilities that we have to the rights of our citizens. So I think there's some challenges there.
Great points, Colin. Thank you. Lucy.
So I work at Hugging Face, and I'm never sure if everyone knows what that is, but basically we have a platform where open source AI developers can upload their models, data sets. There's evaluations, there's courses, so we try to lower the barrier for entry to AI development. There's a lot of this, but the main core idea is that it's a place where the open source AI development community comes together. And so what our perspective on this, of course, is a very global one, right? As most open source projects on Hugging Face as well, the open source AI community is a very global one. And so while sovereign AI is really important, and I think there is an opportunity to go out of this dependency on external actors and the over-reliance on a very few very strong players in the AI field, there is still this idea that sovereign AI doesn't mean building borders between the development of AI in different countries. And we've seen that in the open source world, AI really benefits from this international collaboration. And at the same time, when we look at who invests in sovereign AI, if it is publicly funded, we very much would argue that it should also contribute to public good and be available to the public at large. So meaning we need to invest in open source infrastructure, supporting local talents and ensuring they have access to the infrastructure that they need.
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, there's a lot of momentum behind the concept of public money, public code. Lewis, let's hear from you next.
Yeah, so my name is Lewis Stewart, Head of Strategic Initiatives for NVIDIA's developer ecosystem. It's a community of over 600,000 developers worldwide. My job in that is living at the intersection of government, industry, and academia, and trying to bring people into the developer community and help the future workforce be ready for AI is where I live. And so, I listened to Colin, very interesting perspective, and use Hugging Face quite a bit. But I come at this, I come to NVIDIA from a government background, right? So sovereign AI is an economic imperative, the economic development imperative and workforce development imperative. If a state, a country, a city, a university wants to compete globally, it has to move from a trend to a strategic requirement, in my opinion. And so it gives nations, regions, industries the autonomy to shape AI systems around their values, languages, and regulations. And so, when we work with states, for instance, we do it in a workforce enablement capacity. So we try to partner the state with the university for the university students to actually learn how to build these systems and then support them as a pipeline for the workforce. So it's one of those things where a department can think about its own data, build its own systems to keep it proprietary, because you want your government to protect your information. But at the same time, you need it open enough so that you can share it with students in the future workforce, right? So, one big thing is that we have to keep the mindset that the future of AI isn't one size fits all. And in our opinion, sovereign AI ensures that we build with purpose and not just with speed. But at the same time, we do have to, and Colin's point, we do have to think about the citizenry. We have to think about the what's next and the ethical implications of it all.
Thanks, Lewis. Fascinating. Mark.
Yeah, I'm super happy to be here. I'm Mark Collier. I'm the COO of the Open Infra Foundation, and we're a nonprofit. We host a number of open source projects that are critical for infrastructure, as you would expect from the name, but projects like OpenStack and Starling X and Zool and Kata containers, and they're in various ways seeing lots of new demand for this software recently because of AI and sovereign AI. And we're a very global community. We have members in over 180 countries. So it's really interesting to us to think about sort of open source being a global thing, but then there are these regional drivers. We recently launched a regional hub in Europe and Asia, Open for Europe, Open for Asia. And there is this kind of balance, right, where we want to maintain sort of one code base, one global set of software that's used all over the world, but people want to then turn around and use it sometimes with very specific, unique requirements. And so when I think about sort of like AI sovereignty, the first thing I kind of do is go back to how I think about digital sovereignty. And to me, it's really the simplest definition is kind of like three things. If you care about where your data is stored, who has access to your data, and what laws govern your data, then that's kind of what might make you care about digital sovereignty. And I think that applies very much with AI sovereignty. And I might be operating with a slightly different definition of that in my mind, because I wasn't thinking of it necessarily as strictly being public funded. I think that maybe that's one aspect to it. But just in general, I think I'm very much a believer that the future of economic output around the world is going to be very much tied to AI, generated by AI factories, all this stuff. There's a lot of hype around it, but I think it's coming pretty fast. And I think that the world that would be a concerning sort of outcome for many, many people is if really the only way you can get access to that is in systems controlled by 3 or 4 companies and, say 2 or 3 countries in the world. I think that would be not a great outcome for people all over the world. And so, and I sort of look through it that lens of sovereignty is about agency and control, and the ability to take open source is very, very critical to that, because it gives you that sovereignty, it gives you that agency and control. So that's kind of my point of view coming from the Open Infrastructure Foundation with our projects and kind of what we're seeing drive demand for them recently. And a lot of it does come down to sovereignty in various ways.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think similarly to sovereign AI, we just launched a project at Linux Foundation called NeoNephos, which is pursuing a kind of sovereign cloud that meets uniquely European objectives. And I think the idea as we approach sovereign AI is how organizations can make the most of AI as it becomes a general purpose technology, not unlike the internet. And creates opportunities for innovation at a smaller scale, that it need not be fortress related. And certainly it can be borderless, or that those base layers of collaboration can be borderless. I mentioned an example this morning of TELUS's objectives around data centers. I'd be interested to hear from each of you about examples of sovereign AI in development that are close to your work. So what are examples? What are you working on, or what are you seeing in development, and where, which regions, organizations? Mark, can we start with you on this one?
Yeah, sure. So I think that we are seeing a lot of examples of this. In Italy, there's a INFN. I have to check my notes to get my acronyms right, but it's this Italian nuclear research group, and they've been running sort of a massive HPC kind of cloud for over a decade based on OpenStack, and now that's evolved into AI, and that's an example sort of in Italy. And then more on the commercial side, there's a company called NextGen Cloud, which is based in the UK. They're one of the largest buyers of NVIDIA GPUs in the world, and they're sort of like, GPUs as a service, based on OpenStack. And so those things are kind of being driven, I think, by the real world market demands, whether it's sort of from the research side or the commercial side. There's also a company called Klura, used to be known as City Network, but they're in Sweden. And then there are all these kind of sovereign cloud stack type efforts with different groups throughout Europe and throughout the EU that are based on, kind of trying to build, starting with cloud, but really then there's really no AI without infrastructure. So it's getting harder to really separate what is cloud and what is AI, at least for an infrastructure person like myself. That's sort of the lens that we see driving this. And I guess one other example I would give is in France. So the top 10 largest banks in France all run OpenStack, and that's driven very much by that digital sovereignty, needing to know where their data is stored, who has access, and the governance that they need to comply with in the local laws. And they're, of course, now embracing AI as well. So that's just a smattering of examples, but I think we continue to see that drive more adoption of open source software for infrastructure that we're working on.
Wow, thanks for those, Mark. Awesome. Lewis.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first, I'm just going to say I'm enjoying listening to everybody on this panel. It's actually quite enlightening to hear the different perspectives. And I think from NVIDIA's perspective, we're looking global, right? So if you look at the top 26 countries, from Europe to Southeast Asia to Latin America to the US, right? We're trying to help governments and industries build sovereign AI grounded in local infrastructure, local data, and more than anything, local talent, right? So that blurring of the lines between, the infrastructure and the cloud and all this stuff is a big thing, because, like in the US in particular, what we're hearing from various states that we're working with is that they actually want to keep their data in state, right? So they've been shipping their data to other states. And so that's why the mass investment into data centers from the public side, right? Yeah, sure. There's private industry behind that. But then you absolutely have to layer in, the local platforms and make sure people are trained securely on sovereign data in these national AI factories. So it always starts with infrastructure. The next level down could be your talent. So while I build state level partnerships, trying to bring people into a developer ecosystem, using CUDA, using some of the platforms that are more open that are out there right now. It's all about, from the perspective that I work in the space, public-private collaborations that serve all communities, not just tech hubs, not just governments, not just industry, right? So it really is more for the public good that we're trying to do this and make sure that you bring everybody up, so the gap doesn't just continue to widen, and people have access and opportunity on open infrastructures and stuff that's being built out there.
Awesome. Thanks, Lewis. Lucy, how about you?
So I specifically, given my background, looked at models that have been developed and what we can basically see on the hub. I think one of my favorite projects that I always like to mention in this context is this big science project and Bloom, the model that resulted from it. That was an international effort involving over 1,000 researchers from everywhere in the world. And that was coordinated through Hugging Face. That's why it's quite a popular example. And so Bloom is this like the largest multilingual, fully open source language model that exists as of now. And it's quite an interesting artifact of sovereign AI, I think, and also a model for how we can make like transparent and community-driven development. And at the same time, when we look more at like what are governments currently doing, looking at Europe in the context of this web series, as a web seminar, I looked at the different governments that already are having things on the Hugging Face Hub, and I think there's quite some interesting examples. The Ministry of Digital Affairs of Poland, for example, provides models in Polish on Hugging Face, which I think is a really cool and interesting step in the right direction, thinking of like what kind of artifacts are needed for the different countries, the languages. So Polish models might not be as good in other contexts. What kind of data, what kind of values should they encode, and so on. And there is a LLM leaderboard for French language by the French government as well, which I think is also really interesting because they enable a comparison of different open source language models on data that is relevant to them, that they think in French for France is really important, and that models need to be evaluated and benchmarked on. But also, of course, at large, we see the different language communities. There's France, Le Benchmark, and Le Petit model. So there's like the open source community where it's more grassroots, where the community comes together and says, we need a French model. There's OpenLLM Deutsch, which is a German model. So there are all those initiatives already, which I think we can learn from a lot, where we can look at. And so one of the big things, of course, with Big Science and Bloom was the access, the availability of access in the clusters and the infrastructure that Europe was able and willing to provide for such a project to come to life. And I think that's really important when we think of this kind of models. How will we train them? How will they be created?
Very interesting example. Colin, how about from Scott Logic's point of view in the world of consulting?
Yeah, I guess there's more. I want to take a step back and talk about data sovereignty and the sort of experience we've had with cloud. Within the UK, a number of years back, we actually had an initiative to create our own UK government cloud. Funnily enough, that didn't really get anywhere because to your point, Mark, there are some very important things relating to data sovereignty, knowing where your data is stored, who has access to it, ensuring that your regional regulations can be applied. I think we discovered we can do all of that on public cloud infrastructure. Open source very much supports this. The infrastructure itself is open source, so it's easy to replicate, but commercially, organizations like AWS, Azure, GCP create local data centers because they understand that that's important to some very high value consumers. We're also able to regulate through GDPR when we have products and services within our region that are not hosted within our region. So these sorts of mechanisms can still be applied to AI. Again, Mark, you made a good point about, I think that the way you expressed it was, do we want this technology in the hands of a few organizations? And I think that gets to the nub of it. It really does depend just how transformational this technology can and will become. If we get genuine intelligence, artificial general intelligence, and that is in the hands of a few individuals or organizations, I think that is very bad, which is why my hope is that through open source and through regulations, we can prevent that happening. And again, finally, Hilary, you mentioned the A16Z interview with the NVIDIA CEO. The way that he was talking was of a digital workforce. He was imagining a future where the IT team becomes your HR team because they are coordinating this intelligent digital workforce. That doesn't exist at the moment, and it may never exist. We may not reach that point. And again, my preference is with public money, I don't think we should be banking on a future which may not exist. That's where we should be encouraging private sector organizations to take those bets. and we should support them to make those bets and encouraging those bets, and then using our powers of regulation and laws to make sure that if those bets turn into a reality, we don't get an unequal benefit from it.
Yeah, that brings me to a next question, and I think it relates to where governments can provide support, and is that perhaps on skills training and education. So, Lewis, because of your work in developer skill sets, do you think we're ready today? Where do we need to get to have trained up skill sets?
So the immediate answer is we're making progress, but we're not ready, just because a lot of the readiness, if you will, is inconsistent and unequal, kind of to Colin's point, right? And there's a real skills gap, especially in underrepresented communities, mid-sized cities, small countries. Depending on who we'll say who the entity is that is trying to dive into the sovereign AI space. So that's one of the reasons why NVIDIA allowed me to stand up the practice around economic and workforce development, right? To introduce programs like our DLI program, look at open source tool, look at training regional hubs across the globe with different education partners, to try to look at what our responsibility is as the innovation behind a lot of this stuff, to make sure that the skills gap doesn't grow too far, right? And so we don't officially train anybody for a specific job, but we're a big piece of that puzzle. And so, if we can be part of conversations like this and kind of get the word out that more people need to jump into this conversation, it's crucial, just because of how fast things are moving.
Colin, I know you thanks, Lewis. Colin, I know you've got some thoughts on skills as it relates to Gen AI and sovereign AI. What do you want to add?
I think skills and learning are one of the most important things that we should all be investing in, whether you're a private company and you're investing in the learning and development of your people, or whether you're a government investing in the schools and universities. And the reason being, this is a very different technology to most of the other technologies that have disrupted us in the past. There are qualities of generative AI that are quite hard to work with. It's non-deterministic. It's not immediately obvious what its strengths and weaknesses are. You have to be critical of the output. And all of this sounds quite negative, but the positives are it's incredibly powerful. It can do amazing things that would take human beings an inordinate amount of time to achieve. So it's a difficult technology to grasp and understand, but it's incredibly powerful. The key to unlocking the value there simply has to be education. And I think from a sovereign AI perspective, personally, I would like to see education at the very top of the agenda.
Any other thoughts on training and skills?
So just I agree with the training needs to be at the top. I'm just going to double down. For sovereign AI, you need sovereign talent, and that means bringing AI education to new places. If that doesn't happen, you're kind of losing the fight.
Yeah, and to further extend that, one of the things I noticed within the UK, we have the AI Opportunities Action Plan, and it did have education as part of it, which was fantastic. But education tended to be skewed more towards the researcher and the university education. That is important. Citizen level education is just as important as the traditional academic education.
And dare I say, legislator education as well, so that we can have responsible policy around innovation. But I'm I shouldn't jump in, but I can't help myself. If you had to choose one major motivation, like the motivating factor behind the pursuit of sovereign AI by different stakeholders, whether it's nation state or company? What do you think is really the driving force here? Lucy, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think a very important aspect is the independence, what we keep iterating over again and again, the independence from the big tech companies. And that comes in many facets, right? That comes on the question of what's the environmental impact of the models? Can I measure that? Is it worth it to deploy those models in these contexts to me? What are the costs? I think this, how can I customize it to my own country's languages, values, perspectives, laws, and so on. I think this is a very important aspect for nation states. And then the openness, accessibility, the fairness of those models can be very much differently evaluated, looked at, and shaped if you are involved in the development of the models themselves, of course.
Yeah, it's a great reason to get involved. We'll touch on ethics a little bit later. Mark, what might you like to add on this? What's the motivator as you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I actually might jump back to the previous topic because I didn't get a chance to comment on the sort of talent development, skills development. I just sort of had a thought on that, which is, I think, open source, the beautiful thing about it is it's permissionless in terms of people being able to participate. And it's a sort of a permissionless form of innovation. And it's very much playing out once again with this new generation of infrastructure around AI. And so I think that, it's not a magic bullet, but if you think about all the conferences and, the communities that are online, and Hugging Face, I think, does an amazing job of being a hub for this type of interaction. But there are just many ways that people can kind of get started in developing their skills, and oftentimes for free and without having to be sort of part of a specific company or country or member of some exclusive club. So I think that's kind of one of the reasons why I'm such a believer in open source, and just having seen it play out a few times now with different communities, with Linux, OpenStack, Kubernetes. It's happened again and again, and you see people that have jobs now that they wouldn't have necessarily had, all around the world, if it weren't for the opportunities that kind of open source presents. So that's kind of my bias, but I think that on the skills side, that's one thing that we should be really leaning into in terms of, the big drivers of AI sovereignty. I think, I do kind of go back to questioning my definition of sovereignty, and maybe I'm using the word differently, but I very much, in agreement with Colin, that I think that if we can see, I don't think necessarily the path to giving people that sort of freedom is that it has to be 100% government funded, government run data centers. I think that would not fit sort of my definition of success. And I think that, it is about sort of control and knowing where your data is. And, if you think about even this data center boom that's happening right now, I think Jensen said we need to build $2 trillion more around the world of data centers in the next 5 years. And, data centers are about data, right? It's right there in the name, hiding in plain sight. So I think we do want to see and embrace this kind of demand for people to have agency all the way down to the individual level, and not necessarily see it as, okay, well, we need to have 10 or 20 or 50 governments, countries around the world, and they're sort of like providing all the cloud services. I don't think that would be meeting the moment. I think it's more about kind of many different ways people can have control ultimately over their destiny. And as it becomes, as I think Colin mentioned, sort of this AGI that people have been dreaming about and speculating about for years. No one knows when it's going to get here, but it certainly is the type of thing that we would, in my view, very much not want to have, in the hands of, a dozen people or a dozen companies or a dozen countries even. It really should be available to everybody. And that does come back to the skills. It comes back to the opportunities just economically for people all over the world, which, will keep bringing me back to open source.
Well said. Lewis, what's the driver here?
Well, I mean, kind of alluded before, right? It depends on who the entity is, right? Because nation states want security, economic independence, cultural preservation. Cities and regions want responsive public services, smart infrastructure, local jobs, right? If they're really focused on true economic development and benefit for the citizenry. Organizations or enterprises, they want efficiency, IP control, regulatory alignment. But more than anything across the board, I think the motivation is the same: is control over AI and control over the future, right? And so everybody's marching towards that. I think what you're hearing in this conversation is it needs to be more equally spread out, so everybody does have that access. And open source, it could be the pathway, but going back to the education thing, needs to be at the top. People need to understand what this even is to start, so they can be more well informed and be part of the conversation to help influence the motivations that others may have.
Yeah, well said. I think open source, there are catalysts, and open source is the great facilitator. And on that subject of open source, I think DeepSeek really put open source into the global consciousness, proving that organizations can use open source in very powerful ways, and they can potentially replicate their own version of DeepSeek, assuming that they would want to. What are the key open source tools that will make an impact in this context? Louis, I'm going to go back to you.
Sorry, I was on mute. So, it was really interesting when DeepSeek hit to hear kind of the global thought process, and then hear Jensen kind of bring down the tension and say that this was actually a great moment for open source, because it showed that the cost of inference could come down and people still be able to do what they need to do to produce the models and so on and so forth, right? So, I think you look at platforms like that, and Falcon and Mistral and some of the other open models out there, they help level the playing field, and they absolutely accelerate things, right? But like Jensen said, you don't need to be a $1 trillion company to build a custom LLM now. You can start on a strong foundation and kind of fine tune your own data. You still need compute, you still need talent, you still need governance. And I think nations and orgs are building similar models using PyTorch, Hugging Face, the Linux Foundation, AI projects. And then you look at other open source stacks within NVIDIA like Triton and Nemo. Sovereign AI doesn't always just mean starting from scratch, but it absolutely means you have to start with an intention.
Thank you. Yeah. Colin, what projects are you seeing as accelerators here?
Yeah, I think an interesting thing to look at is there are almost two sides to AI. There are the models, and then there are the products that you build on top of the models. And I think we spend probably a little bit too much time over-indexing on the models and the model development, whereas the products are where you actually create the value. And the great thing is open source is doing exactly what it's been doing for the past 5 or 10 years. Open source is all over the product development from AI. It's almost impossible to pick out a singular open source project. It's that people, things like LangChain are very widely used, toolkits to help you build applications with AI. There are numerous testing frameworks, rapid application development frameworks. There are IDE plugins to accelerate developers, tons of open source projects. And then you've got Hugging Face, which is effectively an ecosystem of open source AI. It's effectively the GitHub of AI. So it's open source is all over the challenge of unlocking value and creating value with generative AI. So models are important, but a model doesn't do much. It's the products that you build on top of the models that really matter.
Great. Thanks, Colin. Mark, do you have thoughts on critical projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, just kind of back up what Colin was saying, that I think a lot of we think and talk so much about the training side of it, but inference, some people think will be 50 to 100 times larger market than training. And so to me, like, inference is sort of how AI goes to market, right? That's how it becomes sort of implemented in the real world, implemented inside of products. And I think that sometimes we do, it's the large $1 billion, $500 billion, whatever Stargate's supposed to be, kind of data centers people are building, and we think about the training side of it. But inference really is a much bigger market. And I think that when we think about some of the open source projects like VLLM, for example, and some of these different open source projects that help you kind of serve the inference or serve the models up in a productized manner, SG-Lang, things like that. And of course, PyTorch is used in sort of both camps, very much extremely high market share in terms of training, but also it's relevant in the inference side as well. So I think that those are some of the same projects other folks mentioned, but I think that we just continue to see new open source projects actually emerging to serve this market. And I think where there's a big opportunity looking ahead in the future is it's not that we have a lack of open source. There's this sort of Cambrian explosion of open source related to various forms of sort of AI, but it's really kind of like how difficult is it to really put that in production when every new open source project has a different version, and they all have different Python dependencies and on and on and on. So the complexity that comes with kind of this massive new open source is something that I think actually foundations have an important role to play in helping kind of tame that or coordinate or get people together and convene around it. And the last point I just want to mention on the DeepSeek thing, I think something that's been very kind of underreported or underappreciated, in my opinion, is that a few weeks after the DeepSeek model came out, they actually did this kind of week of open source. And what they did is over 6 days, every day they released some new open source code. And it wasn't the model that was already, had been released. It was actually a lot of infrastructure software. And they really revealed some of the sort of secret sauce that allowed them to have these breakthroughs in cost, right, and efficiency and speed, which created this shockwaves, and people like, wow, how did they do it? But I think a lot of that was actually released a few weeks after the model itself. And just as one example, they had this, they invented a new file system. I mean, for people who've been around computing a while, that is kind of, you don't just do that on a whim, right? So that it's called 3DS. And, I think people are starting to try that out and see, but there were a bunch of different open source tools they released, but it's really about kind of like how they really both trained it, but also a lot of like how they're able to serve it at scale at a much lower cost. And it says these efficiencies at this infrastructure software side. And I know I'm the infrastructure software person, so I immediately go there. But I think that that's a little bit underappreciated by people that just kind of look at, the weights are open. Okay, that's very cool, and you could take that and fine tune it and stuff. But a lot of what really made this disruptive kind of moment was actually this other software that not everyone's kind of picked up on yet.
I think also you make a very good point there about open sourcing, and it was great to see that they released all sorts of open source projects that relate to the AI model, because as people here are probably aware, open weights isn't really open source. To my mind, an open weight model is a bit like saying Windows is open source because I've got the binary. It's not open source. I can see the binary, but I don't understand how it was built. I can't modify it. I can't do anything with it. That's not open source. Open source AI is a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah. Lucy.
I'll keep it short since a lot of good points were made already. I think one of the things that to me was very important with DeepSeek was not only that it was open weights and that it moved the discussion of open weights models into like the public eye, but especially the model size. So what we've touched on a little bit already, the inference cost, saying that we had big open source or open weights models before already. There was Llama, and they really drove innovation. I think that has always been undeniable, that a lot of the innovation in AI came from the open research community. But what was so fascinating with DeepSeek was that it was a competitive model that was a lot smaller, which enabled everyone to be able to build their products on top of it. I think another really important factor around this question of the open ecosystem is that its infrastructure is of course really important. Where do you train and where do you run the inference of your models and so on? But I think we talked too little about open data sets, because both for training as well as fine-tuning as well as evaluation, we won't move much without good open data sets. And I think Colin mentioned that in the very beginning, the question of copyright. So where do we get this data from? Can we learn something from existing projects that do open data? There has been maybe open data discussions in this open source ecosystem longer than there has been AI, because data is always great for all kinds of computing tasks. I think that's a really important discussion to be had and to be asked, how do we move from here to be able to create the models that we want to create in the context with the values that we want to do in each context.
Yeah, I'm hearing constant conversations around data, barriers to, overcoming barriers to data sharing and so on. So related to the previous question is this idea around how do we put all of these pieces of the puzzle together? And are there blueprints or, we collaborate very well around project landscapes to help identify which projects do different things at different layers of the stack. Are there, how can organizations get started? Are there existing pathways, blueprints, frameworks that, can help the sovereign AI accelerate? And that's open to everybody. If anybody wants to jump in with what they know or what we need, by all means.
I'll jump in. Mainly because you mentioned blueprints, and we actually just recently published an open infra blueprint that talks about kind of how various organizations are combining Linux, OpenStack, and Kubernetes for their infrastructure. And it's not actually specific to AI. Some of them are using it. Most of them are actually using it for AI as well. But we're working on a future version that's going to actually speak specifically to the AI use case and infrastructure. So that'll be released sometime later this year, but it's at openinfra.org/blueprint. But a lot of it is, again, it comes down to kind of what I mentioned before, that there's a plethora of open source tools that sort of, in theory, you can combine and create sort of like a sovereign AI, cloud. But in practice, it's not trivial, right? And what we try to do as much as possible is encourage people to share. How are you doing it? What are the versions you're running? Exactly how are you doing upgrades, and sort of a lot of the thing that goes beyond the code into sort of the best practices. And that's just something that I think we, as an open source community and as, a collection of foundations that serve these communities, we can continue to do more there and sort of like produce these blueprints, because it is not easy to do if you don't know the ins and outs. And what we try to do as much as possible is reduce kind of duplication of effort. That is the number one benefit really that we can provide as sort of like stewards or coordinators of all this activity, is encourage the different organizations, whether there's, research organizations or commercial companies, to just talk to each other and document these kind of blueprints, because it really helps people not, waste time and energy and hit the same kind of bugs that maybe someone else did.
Any other thoughts? Thanks, Mark.
I'll just say, I think that what Mark was talking about is where kind of the opportunity is, right? It's creating a modular framework that includes infrastructure, policy, workforce, and governance, right? And it ultimately has to be open by design, so that any country, region, community can plug in and build forward, right? And I think, open source has kind of already taught us how to do it. But now people kind of need to lean in a little bit more.
Yeah, when it comes to building a blueprint, that's incredibly difficult considering how fast this technology is moving. It's a bit like, the DeepSeek moment really was a moment. It felt like the rules had all of a sudden changed overnight. And again, this is what makes me nervous about sovereign AI and looking at the past experience again here in the UK. It's just last year that the government canned a £1 billion project to develop a couple of exascale supercomputers within the UK because they had set out plans for a future direction, banking on a certain style of computing, which turned out to be wrong. I think this is a risky business to be in, putting a huge investment on a particular type of computing, which may not be the type of computing which is relevant in 2 or 3 years' time. And again, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but that's where private industry really thrives, taking those bets. And many of those bets don't pay off. Some of them do, and we adopt and we use and we make we create value on top of those inventions.
So on that, sorry, Lucy, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's one more thing I wanted to say, which is that while there are those like uncertainties, I think we've seen things happening in AI development over the couple of years that it's been happening that have been working really well. And I think especially coming from this open source AI development community, we have aspects that we should learn from and copy and keep. Like, we know that we've built a grassroots community. We know that community infrastructure is really important to have different communities represented. We have communities in Africa and Southeast Asia and South America. Like, there's a lot more of a global community represented in the open source community than in commercialized products. And I think that's plays to one of the strengths that is to be reused. Similar with like documentation standards, evaluation, those kind of questions that are really core. And I think when you work in AI development, you take them a little bit for granted, but they should be very much part of such a blueprint when we talk about how should sovereign AI be developed, what should it look like, and how should it be made available as well.
Yeah,
I think that's a great point. An important part of any blueprint should be, how do you define what is open source AI? It's not just about infrastructure and data centers.
Yeah, and I will point folks to the model openness framework that's been developed by LFAI and Data Foundation as a sort of a principal evaluation tool to help assess a model's openness in this regard. And how I think to Lucy's point about how we keep that community infrastructure going, in light of current challenges and the fact that while we might see challenges and collaboration around things like trade today, I think everyone here would recognize that the best ideas, the best code can come from anywhere in the world and produces better outcomes when the global community works together. So how can we further work on global infrastructure and work on problems like data and ethical AI at a global scale, and what's the role that different organizations can play in furthering global community collaboration? And I'll let anybody chime in on that one.
I guess I'm going to be somewhat flippant in my response and say open source again has demonstrated a fantastic model for global collaboration, and one of the instances, I know it's somewhat negative, but positive at the same time. When Russia invaded Ukraine, there were a significant number of open source projects that directly expressed their support of Ukraine and how many Ukrainians had actually been part of that open source development. A global conflict very quickly demonstrated how a lot of open source projects are broad collaborations across a great many different nations. So whilst it was negative, there was a great positive there that the Ukrainian community suddenly demonstrated that they were present across so many open source projects.
Lucy, thanks. Thanks, Colin. Lucy, you were going to say something right at the outset there.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's very similar to Colin's point. I think there have been a lot of good examples from the open source world, specifically also from the AI world. I mentioned Bloom already, but there's also the Masakane project, which I really love, which documents and creates data sets for African languages that have been underrepresented, or Mozilla's Common Voice project. So there have been a lot of like grassroots initiatives where communities come together and create better resources for themselves, especially in the case of Masakane. I think that's really to highlight. Those things exist and they work in a global or an international collaboration, in the case of Masakane, between multiple African countries, communities. And I think there is more the question of like how to support those existing rather than running a parallel policy-driven initiatives of how to do this in a very formalized way. I think the practical grassroots initiatives really work quite well. And I think a lot of people are thinking of those questions. There's also the open rail licensing, which I think is usually a really good example of like how to make responsible AI licensing that was also community driven, that came from the question of, hey, we're developing this model and we don't want it to be used for certain purposes. How can we actually restrict that? And defining this kind of licensing from the community, I think, is a really good way to look into this. And it's a very needed question of like how to work internationally together. Yeah.
Lewis or Mark, anything to add about working globally?
I guess I would just, I think everybody really hit the major points very, very well. But I think that I would just say that I think that it's more important than ever that we do find ways to work across borders. And I think that there's a lot of strain on the system right now, and a lot of things that maybe we've taken for granted in this last 10 to 15 year boom of open source that we can't necessarily take for granted in the next 10 to 15 years. So we got to really fight for it. And I think open source is the best model we have for collaborating across borders and saying, look, the problems we're trying to solve, they're not unique. When it comes to many of the sort of technology things we're trying to tackle, and the human side of that as well, like there may be some differences culturally and some of the implementation details, but the so much of it is about sort of what's the common ground, what's the common set of problems we're trying to solve, how do we solve them together? And you're never going to have all the smartest people in one company or one country. It's just not the way the world works. And we can drive much better innovation when we work across borders and companies and sort of break down those barriers. And so as we have these sort of regional hubs and respect kind of the unique requirements that maybe come out of different regions, I think that not losing sight of all the things that we have in common so that we can keep working together, it just makes the innovation go faster, and it gives everybody in the world a chance to have a voice into it, and then sort of like utilize it, downstream, if you will, for their lives.
Yeah, I'll just keep mine super short in the interest of time here. I think, everybody said it, AI crosses borders, so governance must as well, right? I think if you want trust, then, you need to think about how to build a globally shaped framework with local applications.
Well said. I'll have a closing remark. As Lewis, I'll say that it can't get any better than that. So I'll have a closing 15-second remark from Lucy, Colin, and Mark. Lucy.
First of all, thank you so much. I really appreciated the conversation. I heard a lot. I learned a lot. I enjoyed this very much. I think I keep repeating the same points. I think it's really important to think about independence and not being dependent on a few companies, developing in the open. Whether you're an organization, a company, an NGO, or government, pushing for open development, contributing back, and having also, that second pair of eye looking at your models and making sure that the AI you develop really fulfills the values and norms that you want it to fulfill is really important. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lucy. Colin?
Yeah, I guess it's similar thoughts that it's understandable that different nations have slightly different opinions, ideals, worldviews, a different framework of ethics, and that's understandable, healthy, and that's part of what makes us human. But I think we can almost all of us agree that open source is an effective vehicle for sharing technology whilst also managing to maintain our different opinions and ideals and standards. It's an amazing tool in our toolbox.
Thanks, Colin. Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody covered this well, but I think Lucy used the word independence, which I love. I think sometimes there's a lot of fear is another way that we get caught up in looking at the stuff like, AI is so powerful. Are we afraid of being dependent on one company or whatever? But the more positive way to think about that is independence, right? And sort of agency. And I think that's really where we should be aiming. And the more potentially powerful AI becomes, I think the more important transparency is, the more important it is that we be able to inspect it and understand, how it was trained. And, it is non-deterministic. So ultimately it doesn't fit neatly into the box of open source software. So this whole debate about the definition of open source AI is not going to be over anytime soon, but I think that it's really an important debate. And again, just like transparency, independence, those are the things that I think we need to embrace, not run away from in the face of maybe some fears we may have about the direction of this technology and how powerful it's becoming.
Well said. Well, with that, everyone, we're at time, and I can't thank our panelists enough today. Lucy, Colin, Mark, and Lewis, it's been an honor and a privilege to have you share your perspectives with us. Thank you so much. For all of you watching, stay engaged in open source, continue to collaborate, explore our events, our training, and all opportunities to work together as a global community as we embrace the sovereign AI opportunity. Thanks for your time, everybody, and stay in touch. Keep in touch for our upcoming survey, and this webinar will be available soon on the LF AI and Data website. Thanks all. Have a wonderful day.